The Old South. Things to remember. How did attitudes in the Old South towards slavery change after the invention of the cotton gin? What is slave society? What role did religion play in the African American slave community? And what are the values of yeoman farmers? Who were the planter elites? And why was the white South increasingly defensive after 1830? Mythbusters. The South, as you think of it, lasted a long time. Not really. The era of cotton and large plantations and slavery labor really only lasted about 50 years. Myth 2. Slavery really only affected the slaves. False. It permeated every aspect of the society in the South. Myth 3. Slaves must have been utterly dominated by their white masters. False. There are forms of resistance. There are other forms of resistance than outright rebellion. The Old South. Slaves represented 1/3 of the South's entire population before the Civil War and half of the population of the cotton states in the Deep South. By 1860, investments in slaves for cotton production exceeded the value of worth of the nation's factories, railroads, and banks. 2 million slaves were sold internally between 1820 and 1860. King Cotton. Eli Whitney and Catherine Green's cotton gin made a cultivating short staple cotton profitable and revolutionized the Southern economy. After the War of 1812, Southerners expanded into western Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, driving out the Indians who had already lived there. A generation later, they poured into Louisiana and Texas. Each surge of expansions ignited speculative frenzy, and the expansion of cotton was concentrated in the rich soil sections of the South known as the Black Belt. Cotton slavery and expansion 1820 to 1860. Slavery impact. You have the Upper South and the Lower South. Northern ships carried cotton, Northern banks financed plantation, Northern companies insured slave property, and Northern factories turned the slave production cotton into clothing. The Upper South, slaves and slave owners were a smaller percentage of the population. Slaves and slave owners were much more prevalent in the Deep South, as pictured in brown in the diagram to the right. Slavery inhibited industrial and technology growth, yet the Southern economy was still extremely profitable. Blacks and white population in the South. White is in yellow, slaves is in green, and free blacks is in purple. Internal slave trade. Cotton boom caused huge increase in slave trade. Slaves were gathered in pens before moving south by train or boat. On foot, slaves moved on land in coffles. The size of the slave trade made a mockery of the Southern claims of benevolence. Slave society. Growth of cotton economy committed the South to slavery. Other parts of the nation's attitude towards slavery were changing. As you've already heard, abolitionism was a big part. Slave states were losing their political dominance, and the immigrants mainly from the North. Why is this important? Northerners did not like slavery. Defending slavery. Slavery gave rise to various pro-slavery arguments, including in the post-revolutionary era, Southern whites found justification in the Bible for classical Greek and Rome. The Constitution recognized slavery and that they were defending property rights. According to pro-slavery leaders, the slavery provided economic autonomy and independence for the South, as opposed to Northern workers who labored for owners of the factories. Missouri Compromise alarmed most Southerners. Why? You see here is the predominant plants. Corn is in yellow, cotton is in orange, tobacco is in green. Then you got hemp, which is tied knot. You got lumber, which is a square log. You got rice, which is the leafy substance. And you got sugar. Only about 12% of the slave owners owned 20 or more slaves in large plantations. The 20 slave mark was considered the difference between a planter and a farmer. 52% of the slaves lived on plantations that produced 75% of the South's exportation of crops. Cotton, 60% of all U.S. exports. Major cash crop of tobacco, sugar, rice, and cotton all grew mainly in the plantations. Division between the North and South. The North developed a mixed economy based on agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. The South remained agricultural as the planters funneled profits earned from land and slaves into more land and more slaves. Only 10% of the nation's industrial workers lived in the South in 1860. The region produced 100% of the cotton, contained 70% or 7% of the textile mills. 37% of New Englanders lived in cities, and less than 12% of the Southerners lived in cities. Only 2% of the Southerners were foreign born, compared to 13% of all Americans. Society. Only about a quarter of the white population in the South lived in slaveholding families. Most Southern white families did not own a slave, lacked education, and were poor. Even most slave owners did not own plantation. Most families owned 5 or fewer slaves. Plantation owners lived in a life of wealth, status, and influence. The elite. Most slave owners inherited their wealth but sought to expand it. As the slavery spread, so did the slave-owning elite. Extraordinary concentration of wealth created an elite lifestyle. Most wealthy planters lived fairly isolated lives. Some planters cultivated an image of gracious living in the style of the English aristocrats, but plantations were large enterprises that required much attention to variety of tasks. Plantation aimed to be self-sufficient. Paternal ethos. Slavery existed in a hierarchy agrarian society where slaveholding gentlemen watched over their families and slaves with benevolence. The aristocratic society which emerged amongst planters created an era of honor in which dueling became increasingly common. Chivalry glorified Southern women while subordinating them at the same time. Cradle to grave. Slavery was a lifelong labor system. Almost half the slaves labored on small farms, not plantations. Black children had no schooling. By 1850, 55% of the slave population was engaged in cotton growing. Slave life. The growth of the slave population was due to the high fertility rate of the African American women. Health remained a lifelong issue for slaves, and pregnant women were usually malnourished. Slaves were more at risk due to poor living conditions. Slave families. Slave marriages were not recognized by law, frequently not respected by masters, and have a love of intimacy for the slaves. Parents gave children a supportive, protective kinship network. Slave families were often split up. Separated children grew up in supportive networks of family and friends. Slaves and laws. Slaves were legal property of their owner and had few legal rights. Slaves could not testify in court, sign contracts, buy property, own a firearm, leave a farm or plantation without permission. American slaves did have a better diet than slaves in the West Indies and Brazil, and the high price of slaves did encourage owners to take better care of them. African American religion. Slaves were not permitted to practice African religions, although numerous survivals did work their way. Numerous survivals did work their way into the slave folk culture. The First and Second Great Awakening introduced Christianity to many slaves. In the 1790s, African American churches began emerging. Whites hoped religion would make the slaves more obedient. Slaves found a liberating message that strengthened their sense of community and offered them a spiritual freedom. Resistance. White Southerners did everything they could to keep blacks from escaping. Running away and hiding in swamps or woods for about a week and then returning was more common. Slaves also engaged in slowdowns and deliberate sabotage equipment to avoid work. Revolts. Few slaves organized revolts. Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey organized a large-scale conspiracy to attack whites in Richmond and Charleston that failed. Nat Turner led the most famous slave revolt in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. Turner used religious imagery to lead slaves to kill 55 whites. After Turner's revolt, the white Southerners continually reminded to be threat of the slave insurrection. Free African Americans. By 1860, there were 250,000 free African Americans, mainly working as tenants or farm laborers. In cities, free African American communities flourished, but precarious positions as their members lacked basic civil rights. Whites in the South. Around 25% of the Southern whites were landless. These poor whites were living marginal existence as laborers and tenants. They engaged in a complex, sometimes clandestine relationships with the slaves. Yeomen. Most yeomen were self-sufficient farmers. Most lucrative in the hills and mountains of the South, where climate terrain was not conducive to slavery, West Virginia, Western, North and South Carolina, Eastern Tennessee and Kentucky, Northern Georgia and Alabama. They cultivated primary food crops, which, with few bales of cotton, bartering economy. Some yeomen hoped to acquire slaves themselves, but many were content with their self-sufficient, non-market agriculture. Yeomen supported slavery because they believed that it brought them a higher status, white skin privilege. A Southern middle class. Commercial middle class of merchants, bankers, and lawyers arose to sell Southern crops on the world market. Lived in cities that acted as shipping centers for agricultural goods. Political power in the South. Whether a Whig or a Democrat, Southern office holders were likely to own slave owners. In 1860, a percentage of the slave owners in the legislature ranged from 41% to 86%. 41% in Missouri to 86% in South Carolina. Planters enacted legislation to protect their interests. Tax rate on slaves, 1/5 of the rate of the land tax. Planters benefited from public spending, railroads to take the cotton to market.